I encourage you to open up your Bibles to 3 John verses 1 through 8. We read those together earlier from the New International Version. I've been studying with the New American Standard Version. I don't know what version in English that you might have, but it doesn't matter. We're going to be talking about what's being communicated in them as we go along today. And let's start out with just a question. What's the last time that you received a letter? An actual written on paper, snail mail letter. Can't even say that anymore. It's probably been a really long time. For most of you, it might be never for some of you. Maybe you've never actually received one of those kinds of letters. I'm not talking about a birthday card or a thank you note or a letter from someone who just was kind of making a note to you. I'm talking about someone who actually written out a letter. They had something that they wanted to say specifically to you. When Marcy and I were dating, we sent letters back and forth to one another almost daily. We both looked forward to receiving those letters. In fact, I couldn't wait for them to show up, and so I would always go into the mailbox that was down in the hallway in the administration building of the school I was going to, and I would open it up, and I would be a little disappointed if the only thing I received was airmail. Open it up, there's nothing there. But I would always be a little hopeful that, they come frequently. Maybe tomorrow, I'll get that letter tomorrow. Maybe the next day. And I just really looked forward to them because she was an important person in my life. And whatever she said was going to be important to me at the time. Those frequent letters that we exchanged with one another became so important to each of us that we both kept them. And then we collected them together, and we have them in this box now, and we never, ever read them. We don't, I could probably find them in storage, maybe, but we kept them because we're never going to get rid of those letters. We're never going to get rid of those letters because they form an important part of how we grew our relationship together whenever we were separated. We were separated from one another because we were finishing up our senior year in college, and her college was about 600 miles away from my college at the time. We visited each other a couple of times, and we would call each other a little bit more, but not too often because the phone I had access to was a pay phone in the dorm of the men. It was on the wall, and it was next to the boys' lounge. And so it wasn't exactly ever a private conversation. And so it was really those personal letters that really kept us together. But man, have times changed, right? No one writes snail mail letters like that anymore. It's not that we stopped communicating even back then, but we didn't need to send those letters back and forth to each other because, we started living together. And so we had the opportunity to just talk to each other about things, and we still talk to each other about things. But as technology sort of entered into the picture, entered into our lives as well as yours, we're not just talking in person anymore. We're using our phones. So you guys use your phones a lot now to talk to each other, even though you might even be sitting next to each other. We do it all the time, but we use it mostly whenever we're separated from one another. We do use the voice part of the phone and actually talk to one another, but more than often than not, we send text to each other, or we send pictures to each other, or we send little videos to each other, and we're just communicating back and forth lots of different ways. In fact, whenever we don't have our phone, like this morning, I got up and I just ran to church and I left my phone at home. Kind of feel a little naked without them. What if somebody wanted to say something important to me? I wouldn't have that phone with me. In fact, one of those messages did come in on my phone sitting at home away from me, and it was Bob Holton saying, "Hey, I'm not going to be there. We need to get Plan B going on this." But to be honest, when we get our phones out, we're not just communicating with that one special person in our life, are we? We're communicating with lots and lots of other people, people from whom we are separated from in lots of different ways, and we keep those phones handy because we don't want to miss anything important that someone might need to say to us. But I have the question, is a lot of that communication really personal? while we wait for that important phone call or that important message, a lot of what gets communicated to us on our phones is not that personal. And so we've learned how to sort of sift through all the stuff that comes our way. And one of the ways that our phones are now helping us is the ability for it to give us notifications. I don't know if you got notifications set up on your phone, but you can do that so you can sort of not get notified by the stuff that you don't want to hear, and you only get those really special, important ones. You go, oh, that's from Marcy. I need to make sure I grab that one. Or that's from my son, or whoever it is. But since most of us don't really know how to set up our phones very well, like me, I don't just get those notifications from those very special, important people in my lives. I get them from people who I don't really care that much about. And what they're trying to communicate to me is things that I don't really care about. And so I need to figure out better how to get to those all-important messages. Because when we get one of those important messages, we are more than willing to interrupt just about anything because we want to know what they have to say. It used to be that we would say something like, oh, I'm sorry, I've been waiting for this call. I hope you don't mind. I need to take it. I'll get right back with you. Because we sort of saw it as an intrusion. I'll be honest, there was a part of me that wanted to have my phone here and have Marcy call me and interrupt the sermon, but I decided that since I left my phone this morning, I probably wouldn't do that. But, I just wanted to give you that idea that it's just become commonplace. We don't even really think of it as rude anymore. If we're talking to someone and a message comes in and we just sort of check our message while we're talking. It's becoming a part of the way we communicate with one another. We check our messages whenever and wherever, because, sometimes we get a little obsessive about the desire to have an important message come to us. We want someone to tell us something important. And that's the kind of message that Gaius received and that we're reading about today. It was a really important message just for him. Sometimes when we get messages in all of our modern communication, we have to ask the question, is this message really real? Is it really coming from who says it's coming from? Sometimes it's hard to know whether the person you're communicating with is really the person they claim to be, which is why there's a lot of fraud these days. I once got a text from Bill Redmond, a friend of mine. He had been going back and forth over to China, and I got a text from him while he was in China, and he had lost his wallet, and he wasn't going to be able to make his next appointment, and he just was wanting to know if I could forward him a little bit of money so that he could make this next place where he was going to be at, and he would be able to get his wallet. Yeah, it was a scam. I didn't fall for it, but I wasn't the only one who got that message. And there were some people who did. There really are a lot of people out there who are trying to use identity as a way to scam us because they know we want an important message from an important person, and that sort of sets us up to be a sucker for some things. There really are those times that we need to know who they are, where they are. There are a lot of people who are more than willing to pretend to be someone that you know or someone you would like to know, but their only purpose is to use you in some way or to get you to send your money to them. You may not realize it, but they had a similar problem back in the first century. People were writing letters about important things like how you should obey God, or maybe raising funds to help those people who were suffering in the famine back in Judea. And they would attach an important person's name to that letter, like Peter or Paul. But they would end up saying things that Peter or Paul would never have said in a letter. Those, by the way, didn't make it into the Bible. They're called the Pseudophagia, that is the false writings. So if you ever hear about them, there's a whole bunch of them out there. But they were written by people who were basically trying to scam someone, trying to scam the church in one way or another. And they always advocated changes that the apostles would never advocate that we change in our lives in following Jesus. Scams were just one of the reasons that they preferred face-to-face communication back then in their letters. When you're face-to-face, you know exactly who you're talking to, or generally speaking. And I want you to remember that back then, letters was a really new form of communication for the average person. I mean, most people just didn't have access to send a letter to someone. Previously, only the really, really rich could send letters. The reason that was is because, first of all, you had to know how to read and write. And a lot of people back then didn't know how to read and write. And so if you didn't know how to read and write, you had to hire someone who could write down things for you, and then whoever received it, who probably also couldn't read or write, would have to hire someone to read it for them. And you would also have to have the materials on which to write it, and it was expensive for those materials. I mean, sometimes they were made out of animal hides. They went through this huge process to go through it, and they were just developing paper that could hold up to being carried and taken off. It was really expensive to send a letter. And then you had to put some sort of seal on it so that the other person would know that it was really you who was sending the letter to them, so they'd have some confidence. And then when you sent it, you would have to hire a courier. And usually that courier didn't go by themselves. They usually had a traveling companion. And so you would have to incur all the expenses for them to go all the way there and deliver it and then bring it back. But you didn't want to send a message that might not convey exactly what you wanted, and so you would put it in the letter, and then you would train your couriers to sort of be your representatives, so that when the letter showed up and was read, and you said, I don't quite understand this, the courier could say, well, this is what that meant, this is what I understood, this is what they're there. Or if it had some request, like Paul often did in his letters, that person who delivered it could help start making those changes. It became a very expensive way to communicate. But the goal of a letter back then was to communicate something important that was needed to be addressed by the sender with those who received it. And 3 John was one of these ancient letters. One of these expensive ancient letters that was carried by a courier and was delivered specifically to Gaius. You may not know who Gaius was. Gaius was a man identified in the book of Acts as being from Derbe, which was just a small town located along a trade route in what we would now call south central region of modern-day Turkey. The Apostle Paul had passed through this town on his first missionary journey and on his second missionary journey. He had established a church in Derbe. We're not told when Gaius first heard the gospel and responded to the good news of what Jesus had done for him, only that it was Paul who delivered that news to him, and it was actually Paul who had baptized him into Christ when he responded to it. It seems that Gaius, sort of like Jesus' own disciples, left whatever his former life was and started following around with Paul, from whom he learned what it was to follow Jesus. That's how you made disciples. Hey, I'm doing this, come and learn from me. That's why Gaius ended up in Ephesus at one point. He was traveling with Paul whenever a guy named Demetrius, who was a silversmith, who made his living by creating trinkets to sell to the people who came to Ephesus to worship at the temple of Artemis. He was pretty upset, and Demetrius has actually raised up a mob with the full intention of lynching Paul. You see, Paul had been preaching the gospel, and in that he'd been preaching that there was only one God, and that the temple of Artemis and others like it were just man's creations. Now, Paul actually did some miraculous things in and around Ephesus that evidenced that God's power was behind his message, and it was a true word from God to them. And there was nothing like that coming from the representatives of Artemis. And so the people were saying, wow, I think God's alive over here, and this doesn't seem to have anything to it. So those who accepted Paul's message also stopped buying those trinkets. It seems that Demetrius was really sort of not fighting for the truth of whether his God existed or not. He just didn't want to lose his way of life in which people were showing up and buying those trinkets, and he was making a profit off of it. But some of the people he stirred up in this mob really did believe in the old Greek and Roman gods. And they wanted to cancel Paul in his preaching. Cancel culture has a long history, by the way. I mean, it's all the way back in the Bible. I mean, they really wanted to cancel Paul in his preaching. They actually rushed to those who were preaching the gospel on that particular day. But instead of capturing Paul, they ended up capturing Gaius and another traveling companion of Paul, Aristarchus. We aren't told why Paul wasn't with them that day, but he wasn't. Whenever Paul heard that they had been captured in his place, he wanted to go down and defend them and get right in the middle of it. But those who were with Paul said, "No, Paul, this is just way too dangerous." And they convinced him, instead of going down and getting in the middle of it, to slip out of town and just move on to the next place where he could preach the gospel. Gaius and Aristarchus were eventually released, and they were able to catch back up with Paul, and they would continue what we would call a missionary journey. Gaius, by the way, was sort of a popular name back then. It'd be kind of like calling someone today Bob or Steve. There were actually a lot of them in the church, and not every Gaius that shows up in the Bible is the same Gaius. So if you're wondering, the Gaius who hosted the church in his home in Rome was a different Gaius. He was also a believer, but he was a very wealthy Gaius. He had a house big enough to host a church. He was also this believer, and it was to him that Paul sent greetings at the end of his letter to that church in Rome. But he's not the Gaius that this letter was sent to. Gaius of Derbe is the one who received this letter. And it is believed that the reason he was back in Derbe helping the church there was because he couldn't travel with Paul anymore, because Paul had been imprisoned and had been in prison for a long time. And so he made his way back to Derbe. There are some people who think that he didn't go back to Derbe until after Paul's death, but either way, Derbe is probably where Gaius is, and where he had been living, and where he had been serving, and where he had been showing himself to be faithful to Christ. And it was pretty far from Ephesus, about 300 miles away, which is probably where the elder lived who sent the letter to him. The elder simply wanted to encourage Gaius. There is some debate about the identity of this elder, but most scholars agree that it was, as the title of this book proclaims, John. But there's question about which John. There's this long-standing debate in the church about whether it's John the elder that you hear about in Jerusalem, or John the Apostle. But John the Apostle seems to me to be indicated by everything in this letter. It seems consistent with the Apostle John. And if you didn't know, John lived until 90 AD. He lived more than any of the other apostles. He actually grew older. He had plenty of wisdom to share to someone like Gaius. And his later ministry was in Ephesus, where this letter would have generated from. We don't know how Gaius and John got connected. But since John outlived these other apostles, this young leader at a church might have turned to him for direction and support, especially since there were a lot of people who were traveling around and they were trying to get these young church leaders to give up on their understanding of the church and disregard the truth that had been handed down to them by Jesus' apostles. We do know that John, the elder who wrote this letter, developed such a close relationship with Gaius that he came to think of him as a son. Not just any old son, but a beloved son. A son that he really cared for. I hope that you have some people in your lives that you feel that way about. In the church, we have these relationships that we develop with one another. And they become love relationships, like father and son, and brother and sister, and aunt and uncle, and grandma and grandchildren, and they should be these love relationships that we grow from. The Greek term translated elder in our text is presbyteros. You might have heard a similar word, Presbyterian. It's that same word. It indicated particularly that someone was simply older. Jesus used it whenever he indicated that the prodigal son's brother, the one who stayed at home, was his presbyteros brother, his older brother. And it was used by Luke when reporting how Peter quoted from the prophet of Joel to explain all the things that were happening on the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit had fallen on them and some crazy things evidencing God's presence were happening. And he said, young men will see visions and presbyteros men will dream dreams. In the Gospels, presbyteros was a title that was given to Jewish leaders who served along with the chief priests to rule over Israel. Their existence goes all the way back to the time of Moses. He called the elders of the enslaved Israel together to share with them God's plan to set them free. An elder, at least back then and throughout the Old Testament, could represent a lot of different sized groups. An elder could represent just a family, or a tribe, or a city, or a village, or even a nation. These elders would meet together and they would make decisions for those that they were representing among God's people. They would meet with the religious leaders to do so. In Jesus' day, those leaders were the chief priests, the scribes, and the Levites. And together they would come up with some plan to govern God's people with whatever they saw happening among them. Most of the time, they were really pretty good plans. But they were also known to make some bad ones, right? When we read through the New Testament, the Gospels, and we hear the elder of the people of Israel, it's almost a negative term because they were the ones who were always making decisions to do something bad toward Jesus, to oppose him at seemingly every opportunity. There were times when the elders of the people of Israel simply didn't do what an elder was supposed to do. Ezekiel especially wrote about this. You can find a lot of it in the 34th chapter of his prophecy, but I just want to use a little quote with you. He said this of some especially bad elders. Those who are sickly have not been strengthened. The diseased you have not healed. The broken you have not bound up. The scattered you have not brought back, nor have you even sought the lost. But with force and with severity you have dominated them. Doesn't sound like good leaders, does it? But they weren't always bad. There were also good ones. The emerging church picked up this term from the Jewish communities, this term presbyteros, and they used it to talk about the people in the church who were sort of representing groups of people in the church. And they would meet with the religious leaders of the church at the time. In other words, we read in the book of Acts about how the elders met with the apostles in Jerusalem to deal with issues, to make decisions that would affect all of the church. That's why Paul and Barnabas, when they were up in Antioch and they had been preaching the gospel and Gentiles were responding to it, but they weren't becoming Jewish first, went back down to the elders and the apostles and said, hey, we got this new thing going on. God is saving people and they're not becoming Jewish yet. And some of you guys think they need to become Jewish in order to be saved, but we're seeing them saved without being that. We need to work this out. And they got together to what's sometimes now referred to as the Jerusalem Council. It's in the 15th chapter of Acts if you want to look that up. But they were getting together to make these important decisions. And in that time, they made the right decision. They said, yeah, we're going to let God save people. They don't have to adopt Jewish culture. Really okay. They did give some suggestions of making good choices. As the gospel spread, the churches that were being planted, especially by Paul and Barnabas and others, they would come back through and they would appoint elders in these churches. They don't tell us a lot in those appointments about what they were doing, but we draw that from other places. What little we know about these elders and these emerging churches are from the letters that Paul and Peter wrote to some of these churches about the character of the men that would be appointed to serve in this ruling, representing kind of way. John, the elder, and it is in the singular here, who sent this letter, felt that Gaius needed to be reminded of his love for him. And that he was praying for Gaius, and he was praying for Gaius to prosper, but not just financially. He was praying for Gaius's health, both physically and spiritually. You know, we have both kinds of health, and sometimes we can do well in one and not the other. And I don't know about you, but I love it when I hear that someone is praying for me, even if they are distant from me, like this elder was distant from Gaius. It's good news. It's encouraging when you say, hey, here's this spiritual guy. He's praying for me. I love to, whenever I'll talk to my mom, because she has a little old lady group that she goes to church with, and she always reminds me that she's always praying for me and praying for my ministry. And I'm like, man, that's great. I need that. And I wanted to remind you this morning that our elders pray for you just like this elder was praying for Gaius. I want you to know you're being supported by them in prayer, and they're praying that you prosper. John, the presbyterus, had received news from some brothers who had been at the church where Gaius served, and they had come back and they reported to John that Gaius was still walking in the truth. And John delighted in hearing that news. In fact, he confesses in this little letter as he writes to Gaius, he says, man, that's the best kind of news I can receive. I delight in hearing that you are faithful in following and walking in the truth. If you're new to that term, walking in the truth, I encourage you to just go back and read 1 John, his first letter. It's a short letter, a little bit longer than this one. And if you do, just sort of look for that word, walking in the truth, and you'll gain a lot of understanding of what John meant by that. How he talked about people who would live out their faith in Christ and practical kinds of expressions of love. John meant in what he was saying here that Gaius had not been deceived by any of the lies that were being spread about Jesus. At that time, a lot of lies were going around by people who would show up at churches, and they would say all kinds of stuff about Jesus that hadn't been handed down to him. Nor had he given in to the pressure to adopt Jewish culture and customs in order to be saved, which was also being pressured on these young leaders. Nor had he been convinced by any of the sort of philosophical ideas that were floating around in their culture at the time. One of those was like how spiritual things and physical things can't ever mix. They're kind of like oil and water, they would describe it as, which meant whenever they thought about Jesus, that Jesus couldn't really be in the flesh and really be God's Spirit at the same time because those things didn't mix. And so they were actually advocating that when Jesus showed up, he just showed up sort of as a spirit, but he presented himself as a body, so he didn't actually go through a real physical death. It was just a visible death, and he wasn't really resurrected in the body because it was a spirit. It was this really weird kind of trying to understand that was based on Greek philosophy rather than on biblical truth. And Gaius hadn't given in to that either. He was holding on to what had been passed down to him, which resulted in these expressions of love in his life. And in particular, Gaius had expressed in his faith this love for the brethren when they arrived, even though he didn't know who they were before they showed up. They just sort of showed up as strangers. Now, just as a point, the brethren, or the brothers, or the brothers and sisters, depending on your English translation, is not a reference to the people who were a part of the church that Gaius was serving. He certainly loved them too, but this was sort of a unique word that was used to talk about those who were going out almost like missionaries. The brethren were more like the 72 disciples that Jesus had gathered together and sent out to preach the good news. It seems that John, not to mention other apostles like Paul, followed Jesus' example of making disciples, that they made disciples who they would prepare to send out to preach the good news. But instead of going to where the gospel had never been preached before, they were showing up in towns like Derb, where the gospel had been preached and the church had already been established. You see, when some of these brothers showed up, Gaius not only welcomed them to church, but he provided support for them while they were in Derb. He encouraged them to evangelize. It's kind of a scary word, evangelize. The EV comes from the word euangelios. The EU was the Greek word for good. Angelos, it just means an angel, which is a messenger. So evangelize is simply to message good news. It's to share something good. It really shouldn't be a scary word. I mean, we should be doing good newsing to people around us all the time. Anyway, some of these people who showed up had already returned back to where John was, but others stayed where John was in Derbe. They didn't go on and preach the gospel anywhere else. And part of John writing this letter was to encourage Gaius to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. Now, he didn't actually say kick them out the door, but evidently John had prepared these disciples not to park themselves in one place, not to settle down, but he wanted them to spread the gospel and to continue pushing on. And to do this, Gaius would need to make sure that they didn't go away empty-handed. Gaius, who had once been on the road with Paul, probably knew how important it was to receive support while you're out there preaching the gospel. And that might have been one of his motivators of being so supportive for these guys who showed up where he was in Derbe. When these brothers who had returned to John gave their report to the church about how they had been treated in Derbe, they testified about Gaius's love for them while they were there. That is, they told about how Gaius took care of their needs while they were there. And the church was impressed. John notes that these brothers had gone out for the sake of the name, and they wouldn't accept anything from the Gentiles to whom they were supposed to share the gospel. They didn't want to be known as someone who was after their money. And so they were wholly dependent upon the hospitality of fellow believers like those who made up the church that Gaius served in Derbe. We kind of do that with our missionaries. We don't want them showing up and having to just beg for money. We want them to be supported when they go out. John was really proud of how Gaius and these brothers worked together while they were in Derbe. And he hoped that this sort of joint effort would continue to bring about evangelism in the name of Christ. These, I'm going to call them itinerant preachers right now, these brothers, they would have passed through several towns along the trade route to get to Derbe. Several places that Paul and Barnabas had been through, several places where churches had been established. But this is the only letter we have celebrating of how these brothers were loved on by one of those churches. I'd like to think that they experienced the same sort of thing at the other churches, but we don't know that part of the story because we don't have that record, that letter that was saved. But reading what we do have makes me wonder, could this sort of thing really happen today? Could some brothers just show up out of the blue with the sole purpose of preaching the gospel in Los Alamos? And if they did, would we recognize that they're proclaiming the same truth and strive to welcome them and embrace them and encourage them to join us in our effort to evangelize Los Alamos? It was really quite a few years ago now. But one day I was in my office and a guy shows up in the church here and he told me after we met each other that he was from Africa. And he had been sent by his church in Africa to the United States as a missionary to preach the truth of the gospel. And I'll be honest, it was one of the first times I thought, what? We're mission field? I thought we were the ones who were supposed to be sending missionaries. He was a really good guy. I really enjoyed him. He had been working down in Espanola, and he was trying to preach the gospel and cause some revival going on down there. But like these brothers, he was ready to move on. And so he had come up here because he wanted to see if this was the next place God was going to have him move and do some things. And so I asked what I could do for him. We prayed together. He said he was going to go and talk to some of the other churches in town, but I never heard from him again. I don't know where God took him, but I hope that God took him where he could preach the gospel and there were those who would be responding to it. You know, since brothers really don't show up around here that often, we have gotten in the mode over the years to sort of invite some brothers to come and join us. We usually say we're having a mission day, and most of the time we just hear reports from what they're doing in other places. But going through the scripture made me think, maybe we need to do a little more when they show up. Maybe we need to figure out how we can use them to help us reach out into Los Alamos. The next time we're going to have one of these brothers show up, it's a brother you know named Ron Nolan. He's with Cowboy Up International Ministries. We're partnered with him to start churches and other places. And we're going to have a Cowboy Sunday when he shows up in February. We're going to push our worship a little Western, and we're going to maybe do some barbecue. I don't know what we're going to do. It's still in the planning stages of it. But it might be a day that we could also use to reach out to some people we may know who kind of have a Western bent. There are plenty of those guys in Los Alamos too. And so maybe God is sort of giving us this opportunity of having a brother show up to partner with them to encourage us in our own reaching our Los Alamos with the gospel. Whenever anyone shows up, or even if they don't, I hope that they discover us just as these brothers discovered Gaius. And if you don't take anything else home with you today, I want you to take this. I hope that they find you faithful, just like they found Gaius faithful. I hope that they find you are faithfully walking in the truth, and you're supporting others who walk in the truth, and you are partnering with people to reach out into Los Alamos with the gospel message. I really hope that we strive to carry out the Great Commission, and that we welcome those who are extending God's truth into the world that's been blinded by Satan's lies. We're going to have a hymn of invitation today. If you need to respond to the gospel, we want to give you that opportunity. But also as the church, I want to challenge you to be faithful in walking in love. So I ask if you would stand. How are we doing the closing song?
Same thing.
Same thing. All right. I'll be honest with you. There's a part of me when we sing these songs, I almost feel like karaoke. And if you've ever been to a karaoke bar, those people sing with gusto. And so we might need a little